in 2 Samuel. And what we're going to look at today is David as called, David as commissioned, and then David as changed by God. We've been looking at this transition from the rise of David and the demise of Saul. And now what we're seeing, we've gone from the rise of David to the reign of David. He actually gets installed as king in this chapter. On Monday, this was an encouraging step. We took a field trip as kind of a staff. So Ethel, Karina, Larry as an elder, Frank, Mary Ellen went to look at a couple of other church facilities. So we're building a new facility out off of Church Street by Jupiter Community Park, and just we got kind of the outline of it done, but then look like what's the interior, what's the exterior, what are those things going to look like? And so we just want to kind of give a feel for some other spaces that had similar ways of building the church. So we went on our field trip Monday, which was super encouraging and super fun. And I contributed. I was like, hey, can we end our field trip at a place? So if you're looking for a coffee shop, our coffee shop in West Palm called Composition Coffee. So Composition has two similarities with what we're looking at as a facility. They have concrete floors, like stained concrete, and then they have block walls. And it's very simple. So I was like, okay, they took something very simple, but it has a great feel to it. Like you go in there, like, so you can go into a Starbucks and it's like, okay, like all Starbucks are kind of the same, right? And everybody like kind of likes Starbucks, but nobody like loves Starbucks. You don't go to Starbucks like, oh man, this feels so great, this is amazing. No, it just like feels like every other Starbucks. And the coffee's like, I hope there are no Boston people around here. It's better than Dunkin' Donuts, but it's still like, it's just Starbucks. Like it's not great. Like you're like, it's good, but it's not great. Now Composition, they have great coffee and it has a great feel to it. So I was like, hey, as we move into this space, it's going to be kind of a phase thing. So we can't do anything too permanent because they're going to have like phase 1 and phase 2. But how do we create a good feel that's not going to be like permanent? So we stopped there. The guy that owns it and developed it happened to be standing there. There's a guy named Josh and his girlfriend Anna who helped kind of design it. So I started talking to them and I said, hey, this is what we're doing. And I was like, what if you have one piece of advice as you look back and you developed this coffee shop, like what's the most important thing? Like what would be the one thing that we should keep in mind? And maybe if you guys are interior design people, you know this. He goes, slow design. And I'm like, what's slow design? And he's like, literally what it sounds like. It's like, you don't just like make something immediately. Like it develops over time. And you take time even as you're creating the place to engage what other people think. And so it kind of develops as you interact with others. Like, hey, I like this. I don't like this. And so it's sort of like over time you develop the space. And he said, you take time to reflect. Like, why are we going to do this? Why are we going to paint it this color? Why are we going to get this sort of bar? Why are we going to do whatever? So you get time to reflect, and it all just really develops over time. And it really is, so if that's a coffee shop, it's really the way that God works. God works in us over time. It was estimated that it was around 15 years when we started this going through the story of David. We looked at him. He was just a shepherd boy. He was the youngest of 8. He was out in the field, and they called him, and Samuel said, like, hey, that's going to be the king. So between that point of God calling him as saying, you're going to be the king, to him actually becoming the king was 15 years. And he went through a lot in those 15 years. He was just, again, he was the shepherd boy. And then we saw that he had the courage to face Goliath. Then he became like this musician in Saul's court. And he was like Saul's right-hand man who kind of soothed him and comforted him. And he went through all that. And then he became a little too popular, and Saul didn't like that. So then Saul tries to kill him. And he's on the run in the wilderness for 10 years. And he had to be sitting there when all this is going on. Like, God, what are you doing? And now, at 37, he becomes king over all of Israel. And it all took time. God's work of restoring all things, of restoring our lives, of building us up, of conforming us into the image of his Son, takes time. Now, the problem is, we don't like that. We're not by nature very patient people. Weston just walked in, so part of our student Sunday is they were going to come help set up. A couple of our students, Weston fractured his wrist this week, and Liam fractured his foot last week, right? And so if you have a broken bone, there's nothing you can do. You just have to sit there and wait, right? That's your role. You wait, and then your bone heals. There's nothing you can do to make it go faster. I remember I shattered all the bones in my wrist. They gave me this electrical thing that I would set on my arm and just zapping you for a while. Did that really do anything? I don't know. All I know is it took 9 months. And when you're a kid and something takes, whether it's 4 weeks or 5 weeks or 9 months, it's excruciating. But it's actually in the waiting that God does his work, that God changes us and transforms us, right? We all want to run the company and be the guy and do the thing, but that's not where you start. My father-in-law worked at UPS, and he kind of worked his way up the company, but he started loading trucks. At UPS, that's where he started. And you grind it out through all the things. Because something happens as you're getting developed, as you're growing, and that's what we see in the life of David. And what we see in our passage in 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel 5 is sort of peak David. This is the prototype. This is David at his best. One commentator put it this way. He says, in many respects, this selection of events presents an idealized picture of David's reign as covenant king of Israel. So this is kind of an idealized picture. This is the premier David. It says a standard to be emulated by subsequent rulers of the nation and a benchmark for assessing their conduct. But ultimately, it anticipates the dominion and prosperity of the kingdom of the Messiah. So we're going to get this picture of David. So this story of David that we see in 2 Samuel 5 it's a picture. It's kind of a prototype of how God's kingdom works, how God's kingdom comes into our lives and into our world, of the life God invites us into. And we see this in the life of David. And there's 3 kind of essential aspects of life with God that we see here. The first thing we'll see with David is that God called him. The second thing is that God commissioned him. God gave him something to do. And then the third thing we'll see is that God changed him. God transformed him in the midst of our lives. And that's ultimately what God invites us into. God's calling us into a relationship with him. We have a role to play. He gives us a role to play. And also he changes and transforms us. So the first thing we see in verses 1 through 5 is that David is called by the true king. That life with God comes through his calling us. It says, you shall be a shepherd for my people. One of the main points of the life of David, this story of David that followed him around through all these very great things and these very difficult things, from his ascent from a shepherd boy to the king over all of Israel, was that it was all from God. David recognized that everything in his life, where he was and what he was doing, was all from God. If we look at verse 2, it says, in times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. We'll come back to that. And he says, and the Lord said to you, you shall be the shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. God said, you shall be shepherd. It was from God. You shall be prince. If you jump down to verse 12, it says, and David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel. He knew that everything he had, everything he did was from God. It was a gift from him. And God calls him because he says, you're going to be a deliverer. He said, you'll be a prince and you'll be a shepherd. He said, this is what your role is going to be. And ultimately, it's a pointer to that's what God is to us. God promises to deliver us. He promises to be a king over us. And he promises to shepherd us. And it's interesting in verse 2 that they use this kind of prince and shepherd language. Remember, he's going to become king. But he never says king. He says you're going to be the prince and you're going to be a shepherd. And we need to remember that the people had just come out of a very abusive rule of a king, the abusive rule of King Saul. And they needed a new vision for what a king was, what a king was to be about. And this is what God promises for those who come to him, those he calls. The first thing that God does for us is it says that you are the deliverer. In verse 2, it's kind of a weird language. It says, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. Where it says that led out and brought in, it's like military language. It was David who delivered them into safety. It was David who was victorious. It was David who saved them from their enemies. And then it goes on, it says that, and the Lord said to you, you shall be separate shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. The prince is someone who is what? He's under the king. So David was to be a king who is under the true king. He was to be king in the ways of God. It says that a prince would have been like risen out of the ranks. Also, it talks about in verse 1 that it says that you are bone and flesh of us, that he was one of them. So he would be this king, he would be this prince who would nourish and care for them. Essentially, they could trust him. And it's the same thing for us with God. God is a king that we can trust because of who he is. And then the third thing we see about this new king was that he would be a shepherd. It was a metaphor for a king who would defend, who would guide, who would provide for their well-being. And these are all things, when God calls us, that he's inviting us into. When God calls you, he says, hey, I'm a God who will rescue you. I will deliver you. I will nourish you. I will care for you. You can trust me. I'll be a shepherd who will defend, who will guide, who will provide for you. God is calling all of us. That's what he does. And the scriptures say that, two things for this, that everything in the world is calling us to God. Literally everything that you go through, everything that you see, all interactions that we have are supposed to be little voices calling you to God, letting you know that there is a God, there is a creator, there's a sustainer, there's a ordainer of all things. Psalm 19 says, the heavens, what? Declare the glory of God. So you can just look around at all of creation. That's one of the things that I love about South Florida. It's beautiful. When we moved in our backyard, and this has been a slow design, it was just bare grass. It had the pool and then a dirty fence. Karina's like, can we cover up the dirty fence? And I was like, well, let's start by power washing the dirty fence. And she's like, that looks amazing. I was like, yeah, that does. That looks way better. I should have done that 2 years ago. And then we put in plants and like some hedges and things like that. Now, I know this hurricane's coming through. One of my favorite things to do is to sit in the backyard when it rains. I literally feel like I'm in a tropical rainforest. It's unbelievable. There's something in the air. It's wet. Everything's green. It's blowing around. It says like everything around us is declaring there is a God. So if you're here and you're like, hey, is there a God? Just start looking around. Just start looking around. Does it make more sense that there is a God or that there is not a God? Does it make more sense that there's somebody that created all this beauty or that it's just randomly here for being random? Everything declares the glory of God. I use this at weddings. Not only does it declare the glory of God, God's saying, like, where I have placed you, where I have put you in your life, all of it's trying to help you understand and turn and rest in me. Acts 17, verse 26 says, he made from one man every man to live on the face of the earth. He says, having determined the allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him. Wherever you are in life, whether you're completely like overwhelmed with life, whether it's something completely new in your life, whether you're bored out of your mind in your life, all of it are opportunities that God has placed you there to turn to him, to seek him, to find him. Everything is calling us to turn and find rest and trust in God. Everything is calling us to God. And the second thing is this call is for everyone. God's call invites us, encourages everyone to come to him. Matthew chapter 11, this is kind of the message is not a literal translation of the Bible. It's just written in everyday language for people to better understand. And it says, are you tired? Are you worn out? Anyone is tired. Anyone who is worn out, come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to make a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. This is what Jesus invites us into. Does he say you're going to have an easy life, that everything's going to go smooth? Like, no, there's a hurricane coming this week, right? But he's saying, even in the midst of all of that, remember who I am. Rest in me. Find comfort in me. Trust in me. Walk with me. He's calling us. And so this prototype David points us to the true shepherd, Jesus, who calls us to come to him, to be cared for and nourished as his body, to belong to him, to follow him, to look to him for the provision and for protection. That's Jesus' call. That's his invitation. He says, come to me, trust in me, rest in me. This is what baptism is this afternoon. It's people declaring, I've come to Jesus. I trust in him. I believe in him. I put my hope in him. It's declaring who Jesus is and what he has done for them, that Jesus is Lord and that he is my Savior. He has delivered me. He has rescued me from my sins. But what we see in verses 6 to 9 is those who are called are also commissioned by the king. He starts talking about Jerusalem. And what we see is that God is calling a people and that he's establishing a place. If you know the story in Genesis 1 and 2 where God creates all, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then you read about the Garden of Eden, and it says that he made man in his image, and he said he placed him in the garden to work it and keep it, to be about God's purposes, to live God's way in his place. And in the Old Testament, that place was to be Jerusalem. Now, in this time of David, Jerusalem wasn't occupied by God's people. It was just the Jebusites. They weren't God's people. They were just there. And God's people lived in Israel to the north, and they lived in Judah to the south. That's where David lived. And so Jerusalem was right in the middle. And God had commissioned David to establish his place, to establish his kingdom. In verse 6, it says that he went to Jerusalem. He went right into the middle of where God's people were. He didn't say to the south and offend the people to the north. He didn't go to the north and offend the people to the south. He went right in the middle to Jerusalem. In verse 7, it says that he took, in all places where I have moved with all people of Israel. Wait, I'm in the wrong chapter. That would be helpful. In verse 7, it says, nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. Verse 9, it says, and David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around him from Millo inward. He went to the center and he established a place for God's people. And it says the lame and the blind. The people were mocking David and said, you, even our lame and our blind, even those, you couldn't even get past them. But David acquires the city. He goes in through this watershed, and he establishes a place for God right in the center. Bob Thune is a pastor in Omaha, and he had a helpful sermon on this. And when he talked about why it was so significant that he went to Jerusalem, is that all the surrounding cultures, everybody worshipped something, and all the surrounding cultures associated worshiping their God with a place. If you read in the Old Testament, it always talks about high places. They thought that gods were in the high places, the idols. They would go to a place. People are like, man, how primitive they are. And then we're spent yesterday, everybody's losing their minds, at their college football stadiums because their team lost, like the University of Missouri, which got smoked. That did not go well. So we go to our own little high places. They may not be in mountains. They may be in stadiums. They may be I was at the mall last night. Like there are some places we go to worship. But the cultures around them worshiped God, and they associated it with high places. And so Jerusalem was to be a place for the nations to come and learn about God. This is what the church is supposed to be. A place where people can come and learn about God. Isaiah 2:3 said, it said, everyone will come to Jerusalem to learn from the Lord how to follow his ways. Micah 4:2 said, people from many nations will come to Jerusalem to learn God's laws and obey it. So David was a good king, and a good king under God wanted other people to know God. Thune had a little principle thing that he shared. He says, those who know God want others to know God. Those who know God, who have found a peace, who have found a rest, who have found a freedom, they desire that for other people. They see other people struggling in life, or maybe other people are confused as why is the world the way that it is, or why don't I have any hope, or why are things so confusing? And if you see somebody who is struggling with the realities of the world that we live in, and you have peace and you have hope and you have trust in the midst of that, you just want that for them. Maybe that's you. Maybe you're like, why are Christians so weird? Why do they want me to know this so bad? They just want you to have what they have. A peace and a trust and a rest. And if you have that, and you don't want that for somebody else, that's not very loving. Now, you can't manipulate people, you can't force people, but you can share with people the hope that we have. Paul's actually going to share that next week. Super helpful. 1 Peter 3. Be ready to share the hope that you have. And so in the Old Testament, people would come to Jerusalem to learn about God. But in the New Testament, the people of God are called not to have the nations to come to them, but to go to the nations. It's no longer go to a place, it's to go out. Jesus said in Matthew 28, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. So God commissions us, God calls us, God sends his followers to help others know God. So like wherever you go, kids, like as you go to school, as you play sports. One of my favorite things is the Crosspoint crew is like super into fishing right now. As you invite your friends to go fishing, it's an opportunity to say like, hey, isn't this amazing? Look at that water. It's turquoise blue. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't God good? Look at the 50 kind of fish that we just caught, especially if you go with dingo. You actually catch fish, right? Mr. Brian's in charge. We're like not catching any. We're getting the little ones. That's what I'm good at, right? Our hobbies, our neighbors, our families. The call is to bring good news, to help them understand God's word, to help them understand God's ways. We're commissioned by the King. And that's what David was doing. He was going to establish a place that people could learn about God. That's why we're here. That's why we moved to Jupiter. That's why God has you in your neighborhood. That's why God has you at your workplace. There's more reasons than that, but that is a reason. So the last thing, so we're called by the King, we're commissioned by the King. The last thing that we see in David is that he was changed by the King. I love it in verse 10. It says that David became greater and greater, and the source of him becoming greater was, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. Greater and greater, it speaks of maturing. It speaks of growing. Eugene Peterson said that he proceeded with a longer stride and a larger embrace. That's kind of like what the Hebrew is translated into, a longer stride and a larger embrace. The longer stride means that he had confidence. He had confidence to step in and reclaim that which was God's. He had courage to stand up to the brokenness that was in him. He had courage to step in and confidence to step into the brokenness that was around him. He had courage to step into Jerusalem, the place that was supposed to be, this is God's territory, this is God's land, this is God's place. And people are not worshiping God. They're actually killing and destroying and striking fear into everybody around them. And he stepped into it. Becoming great, God changes us. He gives us confidence to reclaim that which is his. What he's talking about like, one, ourselves. He wants us to be free, to be more and more of who we are. There was a kind of a commentary. There was he became a monk. This guy Thomas Merton, and he was like a New York City, just sort of like big shot, right? He was like in his 20s, like did the thing, like he was like running around New York City, had all his friends, and then he became a Christian. He actually moved to Kentucky, and he went to this monastery. And after like 13 years, one of his friends like, "What's going on with Thomas? Gotten a little weird on us." Right? And so he went to Kentucky, and he was talking to Thomas. And then Thomas started laughing. And he goes, "Thomas, it's you." And he goes, "Well, of course it's me. I'm just more Thomas. I'm more and more of who Thomas really is." He's the same person. He was just transformed. He was changed into God who God created him to be. God steps in and reclaims us. He reclaims our families. He reclaims our communities. He reclaims our nations. He just reclaims and creates beauty and flourishing. That's the work he is doing. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And the second thing he says that he had a larger embrace. That he brought unity. He went to the middle. The north and south were disunit. They were supposed to be together, and they were divided. And he brought them together. He brought other places into them. He made peace with other nations. He brought in more people. He had a larger embrace. He grew. Peterson went on, he said this way, he says, the David story isn't a mere accumulation of incidents. Right? We can sometimes look at our life like, oh, this happened and this happened and this happened, and they're all kind of separate. He says, no, it's a story of growth. Each detail of the story assimilated into the next. David more David now than ever. Now, I think this is the warning. This doesn't always happen. He says change can diminish us. A lot of times things get hard, things get difficult. We have change in our lives or where we're at or our circumstances. And we get bitter. Peterson did talk about, I appreciate this. He's like, why does everybody look back and like childhood was the glory years? Like childhood can be good, but you know what is better for me than I had a great childhood. I had a family and loved and cared for and stuff. You know what's better for me? Creating a great childhood for our 3 kids. It's amazing. Like I'm like, my life just kind of keeps getting better and better. Does it get harder? Yes. Is there more concern? Yes. Am I more like worried about stuff? Yes. But it's better. It's better. He says, but change can be a catalyst for growth. Change can stimulate developing, deepening, lengthening, enlarging our lives, becoming more and more, not less. All that conflict and hostility, all those blessings and wonders, all that hate and love metabolized into a holy life. This is what God's doing in that slow design, in that slow work, in all the things. He takes all of it and changes us and transforms us and made us into the people that he intends us to be. It metabolizes into a holy life, a life robust in God and prayer and obedience. He lengthened his stride and he enlarged his embrace. God's work is one of change. It's one of transformation. He does that in our lives. Philippians 1 says, he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ Jesus. He's talking about us individually. So like if your spouse or your friend or your coworkers aren't where you want them to be, like just be patient with that. you're probably not where you're supposed to be either. Right? He's doing that with the church. There is something happening. I had the little Facebook time hop thing. We moved down here 8 years ago. There is something happening. I hate doing these carpets. I hate wondering if this technology is going to work every Sunday. I hate watching people work afterwards. But there is something that's happening in this that will result in something greater. When we have a facility, when we don't have to do it anymore, when we can look back and say, like, man, I'm glad I'm not a sweaty mess after church. Right? There is something in the sweaty mess that God is doing in us, so he will work through us more and more in ways that he wouldn't have if everything was just kind of given to us. And he's ultimately doing this in the world. You're going to be salt. You're going to be light in the world. What does salt do? It kind of preserves things. It makes things better. Light brings life. That's what he wants to do. David was called by the king, David was commissioned by the king, and he was ultimately changed by the king. And that's what Jesus does for us. Jesus calls us to come to him, to know him as our shepherd. What Weston read, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. When we know God as our shepherd, we have peace, we have rest. He's the great shepherd who laid down his life for us. He reconciled us through his sacrifice, through his suffering. Then Jesus commissions us to go and make disciples of all nations. That's like as you go, so wherever God has you, and go to the world. One of our supporting churches is Spanish River. They had their yearly retreat. There was people from literally all over the world. They had one panel. There was a guy from Cuba, a guy from South Africa, a guy from Scotland, and a guy from indigenous Indians of North America. That was the panel. And they were talking about how God is working in all these places. We get to be a part of that as we plant more churches, as we equip other people. Jesus commissions us to go and make disciples. And then finally, Jesus is changing us more and more into his image. It's the role of the church. Ephesians 4 says he gave us leaders to equip the saints for the work of ministry, to build up the body of Christ. By speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. Something happens when we gather together, when we're a part of a community. It changes us, it transforms us into the image of Jesus, becoming more and more of who we are.